Creation and the fall marked the beginning of everything, even before the conception of time. God, the only eternal being, existed from eternity, and in a majestic act decided to create the heavens and the earth, giving rise to all existence. His work was magnificent, reflecting his incomparable sovereignty and creativity. The crown of this creation was the formation of man, molded in the image of God. This unique being received the breath of life directly from God, becoming a conscious being endowed with free will. In the early days, harmony reigned, and man lived in close proximity to God in Eden. However, even in this paradise, humanity faced its greatest test. Adam and Eve, the first human beings, gave in to the subtle temptation of the serpent. The forbidden fruit, offered with deceptive promises, became the catalyst for the fall. Their disobedience introduced sin into the world, forever altering the relationship between God and his children. By biting into the fruit, Adam and Eve experienced the bitter reality of their estrangement from God. Their actions not only resulted in their own spiritual downfall, but also in the transmission of sin to all humanity. The original purity was replaced by an awareness of good and evil, and Eden was left behind, guarded by cherubim. This foundational episode, recorded in Scripture, illustrates human frailty. The event of creation and the fall reverberates throughout the Bible, demonstrating the need for redemption and pointing to the promise of a Savior who would restore the lost communion between God and humanity. After the fall, humanity's trajectory reveals the complexity of human nature and God's relentless search for restoration. The ancient world was full of intrigue and challenges, with societies forming in different ways. However, people's hearts turned away from morality and integrity, giving in to temptations and straying from the path of righteousness. The book of Genesis takes us back to this period where, despite divine guidance, humanity was in moral decline. Relationships between people were marked by betrayal, greed, and an unbridled search for power. In Genesis 6 verses 1-3 we read, "And it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, that daughters were born unto them. And the sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair, and they took wives for themselves of whomsoever they chose. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. Some interpretations of this passage suggest that the sons of God were angels who disobeyed the divine order, descending to earth and possessing human women, generating a hybrid race of giants, often identified as Nephilim. This would have been the last straw that led God to send the flood. On the other hand, it is important to understand that chapter 6 of Genesis is contextualized with chapters 4 and 5. Chapter 4 describes the descendants of Cain, while chapter 5 addresses those of Seth, the third son of Adam. In this context, the daughters of men refer to the women descended from the wicked line of Cain, while the descendants of Seth represent those who remain faithful to God, called the children of God. The word giants, used to describe the fruit of this crossbreeding, comes from the translation of the King James Version, but can also be translated as fallen ones or tyrants. In this turbulent context, the figure of Noah appears, a man highlighted in the Bible for his extraordinary justice and righteousness, who stood out amid the corruption that dominated his society. Noah was the son of Lamech and grandson of Methuselah. In addition to his wife, he had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Noah's introduction into the biblical narrative is marked by characteristics that make him a unique figure. The book of Genesis describes him as righteous among his contemporaries and blameless among the people of his day, a divine commendation of his integrity, making him a central figure amid the moral decay that engulfed the ancient world. While the society around him indulged in corrupt practices and turned away from God's ways, Noah remained steadfast in his devotion to God and his blameless conduct. Faced with the growing corruption and evil of the antediluvian society, God, in his sovereignty and justice, decided to purify the earth with a flood. The biblical account in the book of Genesis reveals the divine decision to intervene in the face of moral degeneration that had reached a critical point. At that moment, God looks at Noah and finds in him a light of righteousness and justice. The divine call to Noah is an act of grace and divine choice. God, in his wisdom, decides not only to destroy, but also to offer an opportunity for preservation and renewal through Noah. The biblical text emphasizes that Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord, indicating that his relationship with God was the determining factor in his choice. God communicates his call to Noah with detailed instructions on the construction of the ark. The complexity of the project and the precision of the details reflect the seriousness of the divine purpose. Noah, a man of unshakable faith, receives this monumental task with submission and obedience. The ark, according to the biblical account in chapter 6 of Genesis, was to be 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. A cubit, an old measurement that is no longer in use, would be approximately 45 centimeters. Thus, the dimensions of the ark would be equivalent to 137 meters long, 22 meters wide, and 13 meters high, which represents an area of over 43,000 square meters. The Bible describes the ark as having 3 floors, an opening for light and specific compartments for animals of all species. God, in his omniscience, reveals to Noah the exact specifications for the ark, with each detail clearly communicated, reflecting divine precision. The use of bitumen as part of the divine plan ensures the durability and preservation of the ark. The work continues with Noah and his family, who dedicate themselves tirelessly to the construction of the vessel. The disbelief of the society around him does not shake Noah. On the contrary, it intensifies their determination to obey the divine voice. Although it is not known exactly how many years it took Noah to build the ark, the apocryphal book of Jerome, in chapter 5, states that it took him 5 years to complete it. This time seems reasonable, considering that, in parallel with the construction, it was necessary to organize the planting and food reserves for Noah's family and for the animals that would be on board the ark for a year. An additional miracle occurs as a peaceful coexistence between animals of different species is established. The biblical account not only emphasizes the animals' obedience to divine instructions, but also the peace and harmony that reigns within the vessel, defying natural expectations and highlighting once again the providence of God. The beginning of the flood is described as the floodgates of the heavens being opened, with heavenly waters falling incessantly upon the earth. The biblical account highlights that all the fountains of the great deep were broken up and the windows of heaven opened, initiating torrential rains that transformed the familiar landscape into an unrecognizable landscape, setting the stage for a flood that would engulf all of creation. As the waters advanced relentlessly, submerging plains, mountains, and everything in their path, the biblical narrative emphasizes the universality of the flood. The Bible makes it clear that all the highest mountains under the entire sky were covered. The rain fell incessantly for 40 days and 40 nights, plunging the earth into a state of continuous flux. The ark built by Noah floated in this vast ocean of turbulent waters, representing not only a physical shelter, but also a symbol of divine salvation in the midst of the flood. The narrative highlights God's providence, which guided the ark through the waters, protecting Noah and his family. After 40 days of the flood, Noah decides to send a dove to investigate the conditions outside the ark. The dove, a messenger of life, flies over the turbulent waters, indicating that the surface of the earth was not yet ready to receive life again. However, the narrative deepens when the dove returns to the ark with an olive leaf in its beak. Noah interprets this gesture as confirmation of the restoration of the earth and waits patiently and gratefully for the right moment to open the window of the ark. The Bible highlights that Noah waited another 7 days before opening the window again, demonstrating his caution and desire to confirm the stability of the soil before disembarking. God's covenant with Noah after the flood represents a culmination in the biblical narrative, marking the transition from destruction to the promise of a new era. The Genesis account reveals the compassionate and redemptive nature of the Creator, who, after the catastrophe of the waters, establishes a lasting covenant with Noah and all creation. The narrative begins with Noah and his family emerging from the ark, witnessing a transformed earth after the flood. In this post-cataclysmic scenario, Noah offers sacrifices to the Lord as an expression of his gratitude and devotion. It is in this context that God, in his mercy, establishes the covenant with Noah, promising never again to destroy all life on earth through a flood. The rainbow emerges as a crucial symbol in this divine covenant. God declares that the rainbow will be the visible sign of this promise, a constant reminder of the covenant between him and all creation. The consequences of the flood, described in the book of Genesis, go beyond the cataclysmic event itself, extending to changes in the earth and in humanity. The waters receded, revealing an altered landscape and regions that were previously submerged. The account mentions the formation of mountains and valleys, suggesting a geological reconfiguration caused by the titanic forces of the flood. The consequences for humanity are also remarkable. The Bible describes Noah and his family, the only survivors of the flood, as becoming the progenitors of all post-flood humanity. The genealogies that unfold after the event trace the lines of future nations and peoples, outlining the human diversity that emerged from Noah's family. Noah's three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their respective wives, are presented as the fathers of the different lineages that spread throughout the earth, giving rise to diverse ethnic groups and nations, thus contributing to human diversity. Noah was given the responsibility of repopulating the region that would later be known as the Middle East, associated with the Semitic peoples, including the Hebrews and the Arabs. Japheth was assigned to repopulate the areas that encompassed Europe and parts of Asia. In Genesis 9:27 it is said, God will enlarge Japheth. In turn, Ham was given the mission of populating the region that would come to be associated with Africa, with Ham's descendants being linked to the African peoples. This division of responsibilities was symbolically represented by Noah's blessing of his sons, each of whom was destined to play a role in the repopulation of the earth, contributing to the ethnic and cultural diversity that would emerge in the following generations. It is worth remembering, however, the episode of disobedience related to the lineage of Ham. One day, Noah planted a vineyard and after getting drunk on the wine, was left naked inside his tent. His youngest son, Ham, saw his father's nakedness and instead of covering him or discreetly moving away, told his older brothers, Shem and Japheth. Shem and Japheth, unlike Ham, showed respect for their father's nakedness. They entered the tent backwards, carrying a cloak to cover Noah without looking at him. When Noah woke up and learned what had happened, he pronounced a curse on the line of Ham and blessed the lines of Shem and Japheth. This genealogy becomes the basis for subsequent narratives in the Bible, connecting the stories of the great patriarchs, such as Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to post-flood humanity. The story of the Tower of Babel is found in the book of Genesis, chapter 11, verses 1 through 9. It begins after the flood, when humanity began to multiply and spread throughout the earth. Although the Bible mentions the Tower of Babel, its exact location remains uncertain. Various theories suggest that it may have been located in Mesopotamia, ancient Babylon, or elsewhere. At the beginning of history, all the inhabitants of the earth spoke the same language and shared a common and ambitious purpose, to build a city with a tower that reached to the heavens. This tower, known as the Tower of Babel, was seen as a symbol of human power and achievement. The primary motivation behind this endeavor was clear. They wanted to demonstrate power and authority and to avoid being scattered throughout the earth. Given the context of the biblical narrative, which takes place after Noah's flood, it is possible that the builders of the Tower of Babel feared another flood. They may have believed that building a tall tower that reached to the heavens would be a way to protect themselves against the threat of another catastrophic flood. This motivation would be linked to the preservation of life and the survival of the community in an environment where the floods of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers were a constant threat. However, the desire for protection against another flood demonstrated disbelief in God, since after the flood, the Lord had made it clear that he would never again destroy all life on earth through the waters of a flood. In Genesis 9:11 he states, "Never again will there be a flood to destroy the earth." Another theory suggests that the Tower of Babel could have been built as a defensive military structure. In ancient Mesopotamia, city-states often faced threats of invasions from neighboring peoples or tribes called pagans at the time. The construction of a tall tower could have served as a strategic observation post to detect approaching enemies and as a fortress to protect themselves in case of attack. The construction of the Tower of Babel had both a practical and symbolic function, representing the defense of the city against possible external threats. However, the builders of the tower believed that they could reach the heavens through their own abilities and efforts, thus defying God's authority and will. This act symbolized human rebellion against the Creator. It is worth remembering that in Genesis, God blessed Noah and his sons, commanding them to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. After the flood, God had given humanity the instruction to spread throughout the earth, but men disobeyed this order, revealing disbelief and a lack of submission to God's will. Instead, they chose to follow their own paths. Under the leadership of a man named Nimrod, whose charisma and powers of persuasion were immense, the builders of the tower had grand ambitions. They wanted to build a tower that would grow ever taller, eventually reaching all the way to heaven. A descendant of Noah, Nimrod is mentioned in the Bible as a powerful king. According to Jewish interpretations, it was he who initiated the construction of the Tower of Babel. Nimrod was known as a tyrannical leader who sought to turn people away from worshipping God. It was in this context that the idea of building the tower arose, in an attempt to defy the Creator. Babel, the capital of the rich and powerful Babylon, was the site of the construction, and the Babylonians, Sumerians, and Assyrians had a custom of building temples in the shape of pyramids. However, God, disappointed with what was happening, decided to intervene in the construction. He would not allow humanity to go its own way by defying his authority and disobeying his instructions. In a divine act, God confused the languages of the builders of the tower, causing each one to speak and understand a different language, making communication between them impossible. This act caused great confusion and ruined the plans to continue building the tower. After the confusion of languages, chaos ensued in the city, as coexistence in a society with different groups speaking different languages became impossible. As a result, humanity spread out across different regions and groups, fulfilling God's will that the earth be populated. The name Babel derives from the Hebrew word babu, which means confusion, a direct reference to the confusion of languages that occurred at that event. The dispersion of the population across regions fulfilled God's original purpose for humanity to spread out after the flood, resulting in different cultures, nations, and identities. The story of the Tower of Babel is often linked to the emergence of Semitic languages such as Hebrew and Aramaic, which has significant implications for the history of language. Furthermore, the diversification of human languages generated by the tower profoundly shaped human history and culture, showing how biblical events have influenced the world over the centuries. The saga of the patriarchs, marked by complex family relationships and divinely orchestrated events, played a fundamental role in biblical history, shaping the trajectory of God's people. Abraham, originally named Abram, is considered the central patriarch in Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions, and is venerated as a key figure in the relationship between God and humanity. The story of Ishmael and Isaac begins with the complex relationship between Abraham and his descendants. Abraham and Sarah were facing the difficulty of Sarah's infertility, which caused great concern and questioning on Abraham's part. In response, God communicated directly with him, offering words of encouragement and reaffirming his promise of a large offspring. However, despite the divine promise, Abraham and Sarah were still unable to have children. Seeking a solution to their desire to have a son and heir, Sarah suggested that Abraham have a son with her Egyptian servant, Hagar. Abraham agreed, and Hagar conceived Ishmael. However, this conception did not occur without conflict. The Bible reports tensions and rivalries between Sarah and Hagar. After realizing that Hagar was pregnant, Sarah began to treat her severely, leading Hagar to flee into the desert. It was at this moment that an angel of the Lord found Hagar and prophesied the birth of Ishmael and his descendants. Encouraged by the angel's words, Hagar decided to return to Abraham's house. This return reaffirms the family connection and marks the beginning of a journey in which God's purpose for Ishmael begins to unfold. After Ishmael's birth, the biblical narrative continues with important events in the lives of Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar. Sometime later, God appears to Abraham again and renews his promises, specifically stating that Sarah, despite her advanced age, will bear a son. Upon hearing this, Sarah laughs in disbelief, but God confirms that nothing is impossible for him. The story culminates with the birth of Isaac, Abraham's second son, but this time with Sarah. The name Isaac, which means laughter in Hebrew, reflects Sarah's reaction to hearing God's promise. Isaac's birth is marked by joy and gratitude, representing the fulfillment of God's promise of a large offspring. However, the family dynamics become more complex as the children grow up. Tensions between Sarah and Hagar increase, resulting in the expulsion of Hagar and Ishmael. As a rejected son, Ishmael struggles with questions of identity and belonging. In the desert, Hagar and Ishmael experience loneliness and uncertainty. The Bible highlights Hagar's anguish as she watches her son suffer, and Ishmael's struggle to adapt to a hostile environment. At a critical moment, Hagar and Ishmael's situation in the desert becomes desperate. Without water, they face the prospect of dying of thirst. In her grief, Hagar places Ishmael under a tree and walks away, unable to bear the sight of her son perishing. At this moment of despair, God intervenes. An angel of the Lord calls to Hagar from heaven and asks what is wrong. The angel reassures her, telling her not to fear, for God has heard Ishmael's cry. The angel reveals that God will provide a great nation from Ishmael. Then God opens Hagar's eyes, and she sees a well of water nearby. Hagar goes to the well, fills her water skin with water, and gives Ishmael a drink. This well, miraculously provided by God, saves the lives of Hagar and Ishmael in the desert. After this divine intervention, Ishmael and Hagar continue to live in the desert of Paran. Ishmael grows up to be a skilled hunter and an expert with a bow and arrow, and his mother Hagar arranges an Egyptian marriage for him. The Bible mentions that Ishmael had 12 sons, who are considered ancestors of several Arab tribes. The biblical verse that narrates this phase of Ishmael's life in Genesis highlights that God was with the boy as he grew up. Ishmael lived in the desert of Paran and became a skilled archer. His mother chose a wife for him in the land of Egypt. On the other hand, the promises made to Isaac's descendants are also of great importance. God promised that his descendants would become a great nation and inherit the promised land, a crucial promise in the context of Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions, as it is related to the formation of the people of Israel and to divine revelation throughout the Old Testament. At the height of his 40 years, Isaac, son of Abraham, began a journey of love and faith when he married Rebekah, daughter of Bethuel. This union was guided by divine designs, beginning a lineage that would play a fundamental role in sacred history. However, the couple's happiness was challenged by Rebekah's sterility. Faced with this obstacle, Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife. In a demonstration of profound faith, he raised his prayers to heaven, trusting in divine providence to overcome the infertility that afflicted them. The answers to his prayers were not long in coming, and Rebekah became pregnant, with life pulsating in her womb, revealing the divine presence that had been shaping them since birth. During the pregnancy, Rebekah felt great discomfort due to the baby's movements inside her body, which worried her. She then questioned God about the reason for this discomfort. God promptly responded, revealing that 2 nations were in her womb and that 2 peoples would separate from her womb. One would be stronger than the other, and the older would serve the younger. In this revelation, God explained that the twins she was carrying were not just brothers, but represented the beginning of 2 distinct nations. Furthermore, he announced that the older, Esau, would serve the younger, Jacob, thus inverting the traditional order of primogeniture. The divine purpose for Esau and Jacob began to take shape, even while still in Rebekah's womb. The long-awaited moment finally arrived, and Rebekah gave birth. Esau was born red-haired and covered in a peculiar fur, while Jacob, holding his brother's heel, announced his entry into the world. The birth of these 2 boys, so different in appearance and personality, signaled the fulfillment of the divine promises made to Isaac and Rebekah. As the years passed, the boys grew up, Esau became a skilled hunter and was Isaac's favorite, while Jacob, more reserved, preferred to stay among the tents and had a closer relationship with Rebekah. Isaac, the venerable father, realized that his earthly journey was coming to an end. Feeling the urgency to bless his firstborn before he left, he called for Esau, his eldest son. However, in the shadows of the tent, Rebekah, a shrewd mother and expert in divine revelations, overheard the conversation between father and son. God in his wisdom had revealed to her that the blessing destined for Jacob, the youngest son. Trusting in the divine promise, Rebekah devised an ingenious plan to secure her son's destiny. While Esau obediently went hunting to please his father, Rebekah instructed Jacob to bring 2 young goats from the flock. With skillful hands, she prepared Isaac's favorite dish. Taking advantage of Isaac's frailty, who could no longer see due to his advanced age, Rebekah instructed Jacob to pose as Esau. The ruse reached its peak when Rebekah covered Jacob's smooth arms with goat skin to simulate Esau's rough touch. The scene was set when Jacob, initially hesitant, followed his mother's plan. Disguised as Esau, Jacob received the blessing of his father, Isaac, who was influenced by Rebekah's cunning. The blessing, full of divine promises, included prosperity, dominion over his brothers, and the power of words that could bless or curse. However, tragedy struck when Esau returned from hunting and discovered the deception. Consumed with rage, he threatened Jacob's life. Fearing for her son's safety, Rebekah advised Jacob to flee to his uncle Laban's house until Esau's anger had subsided. After leaving his homeland, Jacob set out on a journey to Aram, where he planned to meet his uncle. Along the way, he reached a specific place and decided to rest for the night, using a stone as a pillow. It was during this sleep that Jacob had an extraordinary and meaningful dream. In the dream, he saw a ladder stretching from earth to heaven, with God's angels ascending and descending it. The ladder symbolized the direct connection between heaven and earth, representing the open communication between God and humanity. The presence of the angels ascending and descending highlighted the constant and active nature of this spiritual connection. During the dream, God was at the top of the ladder and addressed Jacob with a special message. He reaffirmed the promises made to Abraham and Isaac, assuring them that Jacob's descendants would be vast and blessed, spreading throughout the earth. Furthermore, God promised to be with Jacob wherever he went and to bring him back to this land. When Jacob awoke, he realized the sacred importance of the place where he had rested and exclaimed, "Surely the Lord is in this place and I did not know it." In recognition of this spiritual experience, Jacob took the stone that had served as his pillow, placed it as a memorial, poured oil on it as a sign of consecration, and named the place Bethel, which means house of God. Jacob's journey continued, and one day, near a well, he, out of curiosity, asked the shepherds where they were from. They replied that they were from Aram. In search of relatives, Jacob asked if they knew a man named Laban, grandson of Nahor and brother of Abraham. The shepherds confirmed that they knew him, and, to his surprise, announced that Rachel, Laban's daughter, would soon arrive at the place. While waiting for Rachel's arrival, she appeared with her sheep. Recognizing his relative, Jacob, filled with emotion, rolled away the stone that blocked the mouth of the well and watered Laban's flock. This encounter revealed the kinship between them, and Jacob, moved by sincere feelings, kissed Rachel and, moved, shed tears. Rachel ran to tell her father Laban about Jacob's arrival. Upon hearing about his relative, Laban hurried to welcome him with warm embraces. Jacob, in turn, shared his entire story with Laban, who recognized him as a relative and offered him hospitality. Jacob remained under Laban's roof for a month. Realizing that his relative was willing to work for the good of the family, Laban proposed a deeper alliance. Laban had 2 daughters, Leah the elder and Rachel the younger, a remarkable beauty. Jacob's heart was drawn to Rachel, and he proposed that Laban work for 7 years to marry her. Laban accepted Jacob's proposal, recognizing the tireless efforts of his future son-in-law. Jacob's love and devotion were like a solid foundation during his period of service. Finally, after 7 years of work, Jacob approached Laban to claim his wife. However, Laban prepared a great wedding banquet and, in a festive atmosphere, brought his eldest daughter Leah to Jacob in the evening, consummating the marriage. At dawn, Jacob realized his mistake, for in the daylight he discovered that the woman beside him was not Rachel, but Leah. Surprised and perhaps disappointed, Jacob confronted Laban. With cunning, Laban explained that it was not customary to marry the younger daughter before the older, thus justifying the exchange. Laban then proposed a solution. Jacob could complete the week of feasting with Leah and then marry Rachel, but to do so he would have to work another 7 years. In a testament to resilience and love, Jacob accepted the new arrangement and spent the week of feasting with Leah. He later formalized his marriage to Rachel and, driven by commitment and love, continued to work for Laban for another 7 years. At the end of this period, Jacob, now married to both his sisters Rachel and Leah, had consolidated his family under Laban's roof. During this time, he faced the challenges of complex family relationships and prospered in raising his own flock. God blessed Jacob's efforts, multiplying the animals under his supervision. However, as Jacob's prosperity increased, so did tensions with Laban. Realizing the need for autonomy and wanting to fulfill God's promise to return to the land of his fathers, Jacob expressed his desire to leave. Laban, realizing that Jacob's presence was a blessing to him, tried to persuade him to stay. However, Jacob, guided by God's guidance, stood by his decision to leave. Thus, accompanied by his wives, children, and flocks, Jacob began the journey back to the land of Canaan. However, this return would not be without its challenges and fears, especially the fear of facing Esau, his brother, whose wrath Jacob had feared for years. Before meeting Esau, Jacob devised a cunning plan to appease his brother's possible anger. He decided to send a caravan of gifts, including animals and valuable goods, across the Jabbok River. This offering would be a gesture of reconciliation and an attempt to soften Esau's heart. The night before meeting Esau, Jacob made a crucial decision. He got up, gathered his 2 wives, Leah and Rachel, his 2 maidservants, and his 11 sons, and crossed the Jabbok River. However, Jacob realized that he had to face his deepest fear and stood alone on the other side of the river. It was then that something extraordinary happened. A mysterious man appeared and wrestled with Jacob all night. The wrestling was intense and symbolic, representing the challenges and battles Jacob would face throughout his journey. Jacob had struggled all his life, from his birth through the conflict with Esau and the challenges with Laban. Now, upon meeting Esau again, he faced the most difficult moment of his life. At the height of the struggle to end the confrontation, the man touched the joint of Jacob's thigh near the hip, leaving him lame. Even though he was wounded, Jacob refused to give up, insisting on not releasing the man until he received a blessing. The man then asked Jacob his name. By answering, Jacob initiated a significant change, for the man announced that his name would no longer be Jacob, but Israel, explaining that he had struggled with God and with men and had prevailed. This name change represented a profound change in both his identity and his spiritual journey, marking the beginning of a new chapter for Jacob. The man revealed himself as a divine manifestation and granted Jacob a special blessing. At that moment, Jacob understood that he had struggled with God. He named the place Peniel, which means the face of God, because he felt he had seen God face to face, but his life had been spared. This life-changing experience gave Jacob a new identity and a renewed perspective. At dawn, Jacob, limping because of the thigh he had touched during the wrestling match, continued on. The tension was rising with the expected encounter between Jacob and Esau, who had threatened to kill Jacob years earlier. Aware of the delicacy of the situation, Jacob took an attitude of humility and submission, bowing down 7 times before Esau in a symbolic gesture of respect and desire for reconciliation. To Jacob's surprise, Esau did not react with hostility. Instead, he ran to meet Jacob, embraced him, and wept. This powerful gesture sealed the brothers' reconciliation, erasing the bitterness of the past in the face of genuine forgiveness and brotherly love. Despite the reunion, Jacob and Esau went their separate ways. Jacob settled in Succoth, where he built a house and shelters for his flock, symbolizing not only material security, but also the peace gained after years of conflict. Jacob had 12 sons, who became the leaders of the 12 tribes of Israel. Among these sons, Joseph stood out as an important figure, whose role in the biblical narrative would be crucial. Joseph, the son of Jacob and Rachel, was favored by his father, which caused jealousy among his brothers. In addition, Joseph had dreams that foretold his future position of leadership over them, which further intensified their jealousy. In a pivotal episode, Jacob sent Joseph to check on the well-being of his brothers, who were herding their flocks far from home. When the brothers saw Joseph approaching, they plotted to kill him. However, Reuben, the eldest brother, suggested throwing him into a cistern instead of killing him, intending to rescue him later and return him to his father. While Joseph was in the cistern, a group of Ishmaelite merchants passed by, and Judah, another of Joseph's brothers, offered to sell him as a slave to these merchants. The brothers agreed, and Joseph was sold for 20 pieces of silver. Joseph was taken to Egypt, where he was purchased by Potiphar, an Egyptian officer and captain of the Pharaoh's guard. The Bible does not provide many details about Potiphar's background, but the account in Genesis mentions that he was an Egyptian officer and captain of the Pharaoh's guard, suggesting that he rose to power through his skills and loyal service to the Egyptian court. The title of minister attributed to Potiphar indicates his position as an advisor or high official. In addition to being a military officer, Potiphar was also a highly trusted figure of the Pharaoh. There is also an alternative interpretation of the title of minister, which suggests that Potiphar may have been the executioner responsible for carrying out Pharaoh's orders, especially with regard to prisoners. His strategic position as captain of the guard and minister revealed a crucial role in the administration and execution of Pharaoh's decisions. In Potiphar's household, Joseph quickly demonstrated exceptional abilities and was promoted to administrator of all his master's property. The narrative highlights Joseph's prosperity under his supervision, evidencing the trust that Potiphar placed in him. The Bible also mentions Joseph's remarkable beauty, which attracted the attention of both Potiphar and his wife. The story takes a dramatic turn when Potiphar's wife tries to seduce Joseph, but he refuses her advances, remaining true to his moral and ethical principles. Frustrated by this rejection, Potiphar's wife falsely accuses Joseph of attempted rape, landing him in prison. Despite being unjustly imprisoned, Joseph continues to demonstrate his exceptional abilities by interpreting the dreams of other prisoners. One day, two of Pharaoh's officials, the chief cupbearer and the baker, had separate dreams that left them puzzled as to the meaning of their visions. Joseph, known for his ability to interpret dreams, noticed their distress and offered to help them. The chief cupbearer dreamed of a vine with 3 branches that blossomed and produced grapes, from which he squeezed the juice into Pharaoh's cup. Joseph interpreted the dream as a sign of restoration. Within 3 days, the chief cupbearer would be restored to his position and would once again serve Pharaoh. The baker, on the other hand, dreamed of 3 baskets of bread on his head, and in the topmost basket were baked goods destined for Pharaoh, but birds were eating them. Joseph's interpretation was grim. Within 3 days, the baker would be executed and the birds would eat his flesh. Both interpretations were true. The chief cupbearer was restored to his position while the baker was executed, as the dreams had indicated. Although his predictions came true, the chief cupbearer, upon being reinstated, forgot to fulfill his promise to present Joseph to Pharaoh. So Joseph remained in prison for some time longer, facing new challenges. However, his ability to interpret dreams continued to impress. Eventually, Pharaoh had a puzzling dream that disturbed his advisors. The chief cupbearer remembered Joseph and his unique skill. So Joseph was brought before Pharaoh to interpret the dream, in which he revealed that the message was from God, warning of an impending food shortage in the region. The dream indicated that 7 years of great plenty would come to Egypt, followed by 7 years of famine, during which the plenty would be forgotten and the famine would consume the land. The famine would be so severe that no one would remember the plenty anymore. Joseph explained to Pharaoh that the dream represented 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine, and that God was revealing the future to prepare Egypt for the coming famine. Impressed by Joseph's wisdom, Pharaoh elevated him to a position of great importance. Joseph, now governor of Egypt, was tasked with overseeing the collection and distribution of food during the 7 years of plenty predicted in his dream. Thanks to his efficient management, Egypt was able to store enough food to weather the subsequent 7 years of famine. In this context, Pharaoh decided to marry Joseph to Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar. Although Joseph had been raised in an environment of faith and tradition in Jacob's house, he did not hesitate to marry an Egyptian woman. This strategy by Pharaoh was intended to neutralize potential problems with Potiphar, and by marrying Joseph to Potiphar's daughter, Pharaoh effectively tied Joseph to Potiphar's family, preventing Joseph's former superior from making any accusations against him or trying to harm him. Joseph accepted the marriage without question, as he understood the need to form alliances and secure his position of leadership. Marrying the daughter of an Egyptian priest was probably a way to gain support and acceptance within Egyptian society. With famine ravaging the land of Canaan, where Jacob's family was, Joseph, now an influential figure in the Egyptian government, invited his family to move to Egypt, where they would have access to food and sustenance. Jacob and his sons accepted the offer and settled in the region of Goshen, a fertile area of Egypt. By moving to Egypt, Jacob's family was able to survive the famine and preserve their lineage. This event was part of the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham that his descendants would be numerous. The saga of the patriarchs emphasizes family relationships, human complexities, and God's faithfulness in fulfilling his promises through the generations. Each step of this journey helped shape the stage for future events, setting the stage for the continued unfolding of God's plan in the history of his people. The Exodus and the wilderness journey not only revealed Moses' inspiring leadership, but also God's powerful intervention on behalf of his people, thus forming the identity of the nation of Israel. The story of Moses begins with the narrative of the Israelites, Jacob's descendants, who multiplied in Egypt and were subjugated into slavery by Pharaoh. Concerned about the growing Hebrew population and fearing that it would become a threat, Pharaoh issued a cruel order requiring all Hebrew midwives to kill male babies at birth and throw them into the Nile River. It was into this context that Moses was born. His mother, Jochebed, and his father, Amram, hid the baby and then placed him in a basket on the banks of the Nile. Pharaoh's daughter, who was bathing at the river, found the basket and, upon seeing the Hebrew baby, felt compassion and decided to adopt him as her own son. Moses' sister Miriam, who was watching from afar, offered to call a Hebrew mother to breastfeed the baby. Thus, Jochebed was allowed to care for her own son while he grew up in Pharaoh's court. Moses grew up in the luxurious halls of the Egyptian court, receiving a privileged education and acquiring a unique understanding of the complexities of Egyptian society. However, even while living in the comfort of the palace, Moses never forgot his Hebrew roots. His life took a significant turn. When Moses was already an adult, he witnessed the oppression of the Israelites by the Egyptians. In one incident, when Moses saw an Egyptian mistreating a Hebrew, he became enraged and killed the Egyptian. Renouncing the riches of royalty and fearing the consequences of his actions, he fled to the desert to escape the wrath of Pharaoh. In the desert, Moses took refuge in the region of Midian, where he met Jethro, a priest. There he married Zipporah, Jethro's daughter, and became a shepherd. His life in the desert contrasted sharply with the wealth and luxury he had experienced in the Egyptian court. This transition, seemingly contradictory to the eyes of the world, was in fact orchestrated by divine will. God molded Moses during his years of shepherding, preparing him for the mission that awaited him. Moses' journey from Pharaoh's court to the vast horizons of the desert is a testament to divine providence and the faithfulness of those who submit to God's will. Moses spent 40 years tending sheep in the desert before returning to live among the Israelites. During his journey in the desert, Moses had several encounters with God, revealing a unique divine relationship that would shape the destiny of a people. One such extraordinary moment occurred on Mount Horeb, when Moses came upon a burning bush, which surprisingly did not burn. As he approached the bush, Moses heard the voice of God speaking directly to him. This divine manifestation through the burning bush was a supernatural way of getting Moses' attention and indicating God's presence in this sacred moment. Initially, Moses resisted the divine call, feeling inadequate for the great mission God had proposed. His reluctance reflected his limited understanding of his own abilities and the magnitude of the task ahead. However, God, in his infinite wisdom, assured Moses by revealing his sacred name, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." Moses, fearful, covered his face, for he was afraid to look at God. This divine assurance not only dispelled Moses' doubts, but also conferred heavenly authority on his mission. This episode marked the beginning of Moses' calling to lead the Israelites in their liberation from Egypt. The burning bush, therefore, became a significant symbol in biblical tradition, representing God's holiness, his ability to manifest himself in extraordinary ways, and the divine summons to a specific mission. Upon returning to Egypt, Moses and his brother Aaron presented themselves before Pharaoh, requesting the liberation of the Hebrew people. However, Pharaoh resisted, and instead of freeing the Israelites, increased the workload on them. God then initiated a series of plagues upon Egypt to demonstrate his power and force liberation. The plagues included the turning of the river water into blood, infestation with frogs, lice, flies, pestilence of livestock, ulcers, hailstorms, locusts, darkness, and finally, the death of the firstborn. After each plague, Pharaoh promised to free his people, but he always changed his mind. As the plagues ravaged Egypt, Pharaoh's resistance to freeing the Israelites remained unshaken. Determined to free his people, God announced the final and most devastating plague, the death of the firstborn. This would be the final measure that would force Pharaoh to relent. Moses, following God's instructions, announced the imminent 10th plague. God instructed the Israelites to mark the doors of their homes with the blood of a lamb. That night, a deep and silent darkness fell over the land, interrupted only by the wailing that echoed in the Egyptian homes. From the Pharaoh's palace to the humblest dwellings, the plague struck every family, taking the life of the firstborn of every household that was not protected by the blood. Weeping and grief spread through the streets, while the Pharaoh, stricken by personal loss, finally relented. Amidst the sadness and urgency of the situation, he summoned Moses and Aaron, instructing them to leave immediately with the Israelites. The Egyptian people were exhausted by the horrors of the plagues, and the Pharaoh, faced with the death of his own son, could no longer bear the presence of the Hebrews in his territory. After years of servitude and a long period of exile, the Israelites, led by Moses, began their journey to freedom. Moses played a key role in carrying out God's plan of deliverance. In the desert, he led the Israelites, facing many challenges such as water shortages, famine, and conflicts with other nations. However, God provided manna from heaven and water from the rock to sustain them. Moses also climbed Mount Sinai, where he received the 10 Commandments and other laws that would guide the people. His leadership was marked by difficulties, but his faithfulness to God and his leading the Israelites out of Egypt solidified his position as one of the greatest biblical leaders. Moses was called to be not only a political leader but also a spiritual leader, guiding God's chosen people toward liberation and the promise of the Promised Land. In addition, anointed by God, he was the instrument of powerful miracles recorded in Scripture. Among the most notable miracles performed by Moses is the parting of the waters of the Red Sea. During their escape from the Egyptian army, Moses and the Israelites came across the sea, which blocked their path. It was at this critical moment that God commanded Moses to stretch out his hand over the sea. In an act of faith, Moses obeyed, and the waters miraculously parted, forming 2 walls of water on either side and leaving a dry path in between. This path became the escape route for the Israelites, allowing them to cross the Red Sea while the waters held steady, protecting them from the pursuing Egyptian army. However, when the Egyptians ventured into the middle of the sea, the waters returned to their normal course, drowning and destroying the enemy army. Another remarkable miracle happened next. After crossing the Red Sea, the Israelites, led by Moses, walked through the desert toward the Promised Land. After days of traveling, they arrived at Marah, where they discovered that the waters were bitter and undrinkable. The disappointment and the urgent need for clean water shook the people's confidence. It was at this challenging time that Moses, guided by God, took a seemingly simple but meaningful action. He threw a piece of wood into the bitter waters of Marah, and the waters immediately turned into fresh, drinkable water, providing relief and renewal for the thirsty Israelites. The wood used by Moses to perform the miracle has deep symbolism in biblical tradition, often representing redemption and healing. This action by Moses not only met the immediate need for water, but also conveyed a deeper message about God's ability to transform bitter situations into restorative and renewing experiences. On several occasions, Moses and Aaron, God's chosen leaders, faced challenges from the Israelite people, who in their thirst and desperation questioned God's leadership. In their moments of greatest desperation, some of the slaves even argued that it would have been better to have remained in Egypt, where at least they would have had water to quench their thirst. Tension and dissatisfaction reached their peak at Meribah. In response to the people's complaints, God directed Moses to speak to a rock, which would then provide water for the Israelites. God instructed, "Take the staff, you and your brother Aaron, and gather the community together before the rock. Command the rock to give forth its water, and you will bring forth water from it for the people and their livestock." However, instead of following God's instructions, Moses, angered by the people's murmurings and emotionally exhausted, struck the rock with his staff. Although water flowed from the rock, this action had significant consequences for Moses. God rebuked him for not trusting his word and for acting in anger before the people. "Why did you not trust me to manifest my holiness before the Israelites? Therefore, you will not lead this community into the land that I give them." As a result, Moses and Aaron were forbidden from entering the Promised Land, a severe punishment for their disobedience. The incident at Meribah serves as a reminder in the biblical narrative of the importance of trusting God, even in the most challenging circumstances. Despite his leadership with faith and courage, Moses experienced the consequences of his lack of trust at that critical moment. The death of Moses is shrouded in mystery and singularity, revealing a unique episode in the biblical narrative. According to the scriptures, Moses climbed Mount Nebo, from where he saw the Promised Land before he died. The account is recorded in the book of Deuteronomy chapter 34. Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, which faces Jericho. And the Lord showed him the whole land, from Gilead to Dan, all Naphtali, the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah as far as the Mediterranean Sea, the Negev, and the region of the valley of Jericho, the city of palms, as far as Zoar. And the Lord said to him, "This is the land I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants. I have shown it to you with your own eyes, but you shall not cross over into it." So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord, and God buried him in a valley in the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor, and no one knows where he was buried to this day. Although Moses did not physically enter the Promised Land, his role as a leader and lawgiver left a lasting legacy. His death marked the end of an era and the transition of leadership to Joshua, who would lead the Israelites in conquering the Promised Land. The conquest of the Promised Land, led by Joshua after the death of Moses, is a moving story that highlights Joshua's courageous leadership as well as the challenges faced by the people of Israel as they sought to establish themselves in the land God had promised them. Joshua, a devoted disciple of Moses, was chosen to succeed him. Joshua was chosen by God to lead the Israelites across the Jordan and oversee the conquest of the Promised Land. His commitment to God's will and unwavering faith made him a central figure in this crucial chapter of Israel's history. However, before they actually entered the land, a remarkable episode revealed the tension between faith and unbelief. Joshua sent 12 spies to explore the land of Canaan. Although the land was fertile and plentiful, most of the spies returned with a fearful report, highlighting the seemingly impenetrable fortresses of the Canaanite cities. Only Joshua and Caleb maintained a confident perspective on God's ability to deliver the Promised Land. The people's unbelief, influenced by the negative report of most of the spies, had significant consequences. God, in his justice, determined that this doubtful generation would not enter the Promised Land. As a result, the Israelites wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, learning lessons of trust and total dependence on God. Finally, under Joshua's leadership, the conquest of the Promised Land began gradually and strategically. Cities like Jericho, known for their formidable walls, fell to divinely inspired plans. Each victory, despite the challenges, confirmed God's faithfulness to his promise and strengthened the people's trust in Joshua as their appointed leader. The gradual conquest of the land not only symbolized the fulfillment of the promises made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but also solidified Israel's position as God's chosen people. This chapter of biblical history recounts epic events of battles and victories, highlighting the importance of faith, obedience, and unwavering trust in divine providence. The period of the Judges, which occurred between the conquest of the Promised Land and the establishment of the monarchy, was marked by a repetition of cycles that revealed the spiritual instability of the people and their tendency to disobey God. During this time, the Israelites went through several phases of apostasy, turning away from the exclusive worship of God and giving themselves over to idolatrous practices. As a result of their disobedience, the people faced oppression from neighboring nations, which led them to cry out for help. In his mercy, God raised up judges to free the people from oppression and guide them back to the path of obedience. These leaders, inspired by the Holy Spirit, played crucial roles during turbulent times. Among the judges, Gideon stands out as the fearless leader who, despite his initial reluctance, led the Israelites to victory over the Midianites. God instructed Gideon to reduce his army considerably to demonstrate that the victory would be God's work. With a small group of men, Gideon defeated the Midianites through an ingenious strategy involving torches and pitchers at night. The victory was remarkable, and Gideon became the judge of Israel for 40 years. Another judge, Jephthah, faced personal challenges as he led the Israelites against their enemies. Samson, also a judge of Israel, has an amazing story. Born miraculously to a woman named Manoah, who was barren, Samson received the news of his birth from an angel of the Lord. The instruction was that he be consecrated as a Nazirite from birth, abstaining from wine and avoiding contamination with unclean things. With the Spirit of the Lord upon him, Samson grew up and demonstrated extraordinary physical strength. Despite his Nazirite vow, Samson became romantically involved with a Philistine woman named Delilah. She went down in history as Samson's great love, but unlike true love, her motivation was tied to greed and loyalty to her nation. The Philistine leaders sought Delilah for help in discovering the source of Samson's supernatural strength, which posed a great threat to their rule. Aware of her influence over Samson, Delilah decided to use her charms to discover the secret of his strength. In several attempts, she questioned Samson about the source of his power, receiving misleading answers as she tested his trust and loyalty. The story reaches a turning point when Delilah, persistent in her quest, finally manages to get Samson to reveal the truth about his strength, which was linked to his Nazirite vow, including refraining from cutting his hair. With this crucial information, Delilah cuts Samson's hair while he sleeps. Delilah's betrayal leads to Samson's capture by the Philistines, who blind him and place him in chains. However, the story does not end there. Despite his blindness and imprisonment, Samson calls upon divine help and regains his strength one last time. In the climactic moment, he pulls down the pillars of the Philistine temple, sacrificing himself to defeat his enemies. Delilah's story serves as a warning about the dangers of manipulation, betrayal, and misplaced trust. Her pursuit of personal gain and loyalty to her nation results in Samson's downfall and eventually her own ruin. In addition to these leaders, Samuel also emerges as an important figure toward the end of the period of the Judges. He was a man married to two women, Peninnah and Hannah. Hannah, the barren wife, grieved deeply over her childlessness, while Peninnah had sons. Annually, the family went to the sanctuary at Shiloh to worship God. On one such visit, Hannah, distressed by her infertility, prayed fervently to the Lord, promising to dedicate her son to him if she were blessed with a child. God heard her pleas, and Hannah conceived a son, whom she named Samuel, which means asked of God. After weaning Samuel, Hannah kept her promise and took him to the sanctuary at Shiloh, where he was given over to serve the Lord under the care of the priest Eli. Samuel grew up at the sanctuary at Shiloh, learning to serve God under Eli's guidance. From a young age, God called Samuel to be a prophet, and he became one of Israel's most important leaders and judges. Another important leader of Israel was Deborah, who played a crucial role at a time when the people were being oppressed by the Canaanites, specifically by the enemy commander Sisera. The people of Israel cried out to God for help, and God answered through Deborah, who served as both a spiritual leader and a judicial ruler. Deborah demonstrated deep faith in God, and her position as a prophetess indicated an intimate connection with divine guidance. She called upon Barak, an Israelite military leader, to lead the troops in battle against Sisera. In addition to prophesying victory over Sisera, Deborah warned that the glory of the victory would go to a woman, not Barak. After the battle, led by Barak and Deborah, Sisera fled the battlefield toward the tent of Jael, a woman who had also played a key role in Sisera's defeat. Sisera sought refuge in Jael's tent, knowing that the Kenites were allies and hoping to find shelter there. Jael welcomed him, offering him milk and a blanket to rest under. While Sisera slept, Jael seized the opportunity to act. With great courage and determination, she took a tent peg and, hammering it hard, drove it into Sisera's temple, pinning her to the ground. This act resulted in Sisera's death and fulfilled Deborah's prophecy that the glory of victory would not go to Barak, but to a woman. The battle culminated in the defeat of the Canaanites and the liberation of Israel. Deborah expressed her gratitude to God for his intervention with a hymn of praise, recorded in the book of Judges, chapter 5, known as the Song of Deborah. The period of the Judges is characterized by the dynamics between the unfaithfulness of the people of Israel, divine discipline, and God's gracious provision through chosen leaders. This phase set the stage for the transition to the Age of Kings, a new stage in the journey of God's people. The monarchy in Israel began with significant events, beginning with the people's request for a king. This desire was influenced by observations of other nations that had monarchs. Although this decision was accepted by God as a reflection of the will of the people, it also revealed a lack of trust in God as the supreme ruler. Respecting the people's choice, God granted them a king, and Saul was anointed as the first king of Israel. Saul's reign was marked by successes, such as the victory over the Amalekites, but also by failures, including disobedience to divine instructions. Later, David, a young shepherd anointed by Samuel, was chosen by God to be king. The story begins in Bethlehem, a small town in Judah, where a simple family lived. David, the young shepherd, not only cared for his sheep, but also saw it as a divine school. In the green fields, he learned the art of leading, protecting, and nurturing, and his courage was forged in defending the flock from threats. With his harp in hand, David found an intimate connection with God in the songs he sang. David's father, Jesse, was a God-fearing man. When the prophet Samuel was sent by God to anoint the next king of Israel, Jesse presented his sons before him. However, God did not choose Jesse's older sons, who were strong and impressive in human eyes. Instead, God instructed Samuel to anoint his younger son David, the young shepherd. David was chosen not for his appearance, but for his obedient heart and unwavering faith. Even though he was the youngest and least notable in the eyes of men, God saw something special in David. It was at this moment that Samuel heard the divine voice and anointed David, not only consecrating him as king, but marking him as God's chosen one. There, in the fields that witnessed his humility, David received a divine mission. Thus he began his journey, carrying with him not only the shepherd's staff, but also the divine anointing that would guide his steps to the throne of Israel. At that time, the Philistines and the Israelites were in conflict over territorial issues. The historical power struggles and rivalries between the Philistines and the Israelites reached their climax when the Philistines gathered their army and prepared to face the Israelites. The two armies were camped on opposite sides with a valley between them. The Philistines had Goliath, a giant warrior, as their champion, and he challenged the Israelites to send a representative to fight him in single combat. The proposal was that if Goliath won, the Israelites would surrender. If the Israelite representative won, the Philistines would surrender. This single challenge was intended to avoid a full-scale conflict, saving lives and deciding the battle more efficiently. In addition to his physical imposingness, Goliath taunted the Israelites with insults, mocking their faith and courage. However, the Israelite soldiers were apprehensive, and none of them dared to face this formidable giant. However, against all odds, David volunteered. Without the soldier's fancy armor, he chose to face the giant with a sling, 5 stones, and above all, an unshakable faith in God. King Saul, perplexed, questioned the young shepherd's choice, but David proclaimed confidence in his experience as a shepherd, where he had already faced lions and bears to protect his sheep. He did not fear Goliath, for he trusted in something greater than his own abilities. The day of battle arrived, and as Goliath advanced, David ran toward the giant. With a single thrown stone, guided by the hand of God, the story took an unexpected turn. Goliath, the invincible giant in the eyes of men, fell in defeat. The victory was not due to physical strength, but to the fearless faith of a young shepherd who trusted in the living God. What began as a story of admiration and triumph, however, evolved into a drama filled with jealousy, betrayal, and surprisingly, unshakable friendship. King Saul, once anointed by God to lead Israel, found in David a valiant warrior and military leader. However, as David's victories accumulated and his popularity grew, a shadow of discontent crept into Saul's heart. What could have been a relationship of mentorship and cooperation turned into envy and fear for the success of the anointed young man. The turning point came when the women of Israel sang, "Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s." 1 Samuel 18:7. This simple melody, celebrating the achievements of both leaders, unleashed an uncontrollable fury in Saul's heart. From that moment on, envy clouded his vision and altered the course of his relationship with David. Consumed by paranoia and jealousy, Saul began to plot David's death. He attempted to throw a spear at David while David played the harp to soothe the king's torments, and he sent him into dangerous battles, hoping that he would fall into the hands of his enemies. Yet despite all of Saul's efforts, David continued to prosper, protected by the hand of God. As the relationship between Saul and David crumbled, an unexpected friendship blossomed. Saul's son Jonathan fell in love with David's courage and character. This friendship grew stronger amid Saul's growing hostility toward David. Jonathan, in an act of courage and loyalty, warned David of his father's plans. The friendship between David and Jonathan became a beacon of hope and emotional support. And even when Saul was determined to destroy David, Jonathan stood by his friend, willing to sacrifice his own safety. The story of David and Jonathan reaches its climax when Jonathan recognizes that God had chosen David to be the next king, not himself. This recognition reflects extraordinary humility and selflessness, as Jonathan accepted the role God had destined for David, rather than clinging to the power and position that would naturally come to him as heir to the throne. Later, during a battle with the Philistines on Mount Gilboa, King Saul met his tragic death. Jonathan, the heir to the throne, also fell alongside his father. With the death of Saul and Jonathan, David finally ascended to the throne of Israel. However, he did not rush to assume leadership, seeking divine guidance. David's lament over the loss of Saul and Jonathan is recorded in a poem that expresses the complexity of his emotions. The nobles on high are wounded. Jonathan has come down mortally wounded. I am in anguish for you, my brother Jonathan. You were beloved and dear to me. Your friendship was more wonderful to me than the love of women. 2 Samuel 1:25. David distinguished himself as a skilled military leader, and his victorious campaigns expanded the borders of Israel, cementing his position as a respected king. However, his most significant achievement was bringing the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. David fervently and devotedly desired to bring the divine presence to the capital of Israel. The Ark, which was located at Kiriath Jearim, had been captured by the Philistines during a conflict with the Israelites and had been in their possession for a time. The Ark of the Covenant, also known as the Ark of the Covenant, was a sacred object mentioned in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament. Inside the Ark were the 10 Commandments, the stone tablets containing the moral principles given by God to Moses on Mount Sinai. The ark also contained a pot of manna, the bread miraculously provided to Israel during their wilderness journey, and Aaron's rod, which blossomed as a sign of his election as high priest. For the Israelites, the ark represented God's presence among his people and symbolized the covenant between God and Israel. With great joy and celebration, David brought the ark to Jerusalem, dancing before it with humility and devotion. This event not only symbolized the centrality of worship in David's life, but also marked Jerusalem as God's chosen city. Amidst the laurels of his military victories and conquests as king, David, anointed by God, found himself immersed in a dark episode that shook the foundations of his life. This incident involved Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah, one of David's valiant warriors. When David saw Bathsheba bathing, he gave in to temptation and committed adultery with her. This act, motivated by lust and selfishness, set in motion a chain of events that changed the course of David's life and profoundly affected his relationship with God. Bathsheba became pregnant as a result of this encounter, and the plot thickened further when David tried to cover up his sin. Upon realizing that Bathsheba was pregnant, David tried to bring Uriah home from battle, hoping that he would sleep with his wife and thus conceal the true paternity of the child. However, Uriah, a man of great loyalty, refused to go home while his comrades were in combat. Uriah, a man of integrity, refused to enjoy the comforts of his home while his comrades were on the battlefield. Faced with such loyalty, David, in an act of desperation, sent Uriah to the front lines of battle, where he was deliberately put in harm's way and was eventually killed. David acknowledged his guilt and sin before God, and his repentance was expressed in Psalm 51, a poem of deep contrition in which he cries out for divine mercy and forgiveness. "Have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love. According to your abundant compassion, blot out my transgressions." Psalm 51. God, in his grace, responded to David's sincere repentance by forgiving his sins. However, the earthly consequences still manifested themselves. The child resulting from the adultery died, and David's house became marked by family conflicts and instability. At the height of his reign, when he had already faced battles, consolidated Jerusalem, and strengthened the kingdom of Israel, David found himself facing a crucial moment. Already old and weakened, he became aware of his own mortality and, guided by divine direction, realized that it was time to transfer the covenant promise to the next generation. This story is recorded in the book of 1 Kings, chapter 2. David summoned his son Solomon, who was about to succeed him as king, and shared with him the importance of the covenant that God had established. David recalled the divine promise that one of his descendants would rule over Israel forever, highlighting the responsibility and greatness of this mission. David's death is recorded in the Old Testament in the book of 1 Kings. Although the biblical narrative does not provide specific details about the cause of his death, it indicates that he died at an advanced age after a long reign. In the last moments of his life, David summoned his son Solomon and gave him final instructions, offering him wise advice on how to govern and treat certain people in his kingdom. Solomon's accession to the throne of Israel occurred in a context marked by challenges and family intrigue. After David's death, his son Adonijah attempted to assume the throne, but the prophetic intervention of Nathan and Bathsheba ensured that Solomon, God's chosen one, was crowned king. The divine revelation to David, in which Solomon was told that he would replace him and build the temple in Jerusalem, is recorded in the first book of Chronicles, chapter 22. God said, "You have shed much blood and fought many wars. You will not build a temple for me, because you have shed much blood on the ground before me. However, you will have a son who will be a man of peace and quiet. I will save him from all his enemies around him. His name will be Solomon, and I will give peace and quiet to Israel." During the reign of Solomon, whose name means peace, he promoted stability and unity in the kingdom. Solomon's most notable characteristic was his extraordinary wisdom, which set him apart from the leaders of his time. Early in his reign, Solomon made a significant covenant with God, evidencing not only his wisdom but also his intention to seek divine guidance in governing. The terms of this covenant are documented in the book of 1 Kings chapter 3, verses 3 through 14. The pivotal event occurred at Gibeon, where Solomon offered sacrifices before the Lord. That night, God appeared to Solomon in a dream and said, "Ask me for what you want me to give you." In his response, Solomon demonstrated humility in acknowledging the great responsibility of leading the people of Israel, emphasizing in particular the need for wisdom to rule and judge justly. He expressed his complete dependence on God to guide him and help him make wise decisions that would benefit his people. By asking for wisdom rather than wealth or personal success, Solomon revealed his desire to lead with integrity and justice, reflecting the heart of a wise and God-fearing leader. God's response was remarkable. He commended Solomon's choice, and in addition to granting him the wisdom he requested, also promised additional blessings, such as riches and honor that would be unmatched in all of Israel's history. A famous episode that exemplifies Solomon's wisdom is the judgment of the two women who were competing for motherhood of a child. The story, found in the first book of Kings, chapter 3, verses 16 to 20, describes two women who lived together and gave birth at the same time. However, one of the children died, and both women began to claim the surviving child as their own. Faced with this impasse, they went before King Solomon seeking justice. Rather than make a rash decision, Solomon proposed an extraordinary solution. He suggested dividing the child in half and giving half to each woman. The reaction of each woman revealed who the real mother was. The woman who genuinely loved the child begged the king not to harm the child and suggested that it be given to the other woman. The other woman, who was not the biological mother, agreed to the proposal to divide the child. Solomon's shrewd response revealed the real mother, who was willing to give up the child to protect it from harm. Solomon then proclaimed that the real mother was the one who had shown genuine maternal love, and ordered that the child be given to her. In addition to his wisdom, Solomon was known for his remarkable accomplishments, including the construction of the temple in Jerusalem. This magnificent project not only served as the spiritual center of the kingdom, but also symbolized God's continued presence among the people of Israel. The grandeur of the temple not only demonstrated Solomon's administrative ability, but also the wealth and prosperity of the kingdom. The desire to build a temple dedicated to the Lord was initially conceived by his father, King David. However, it was Solomon who continued this noble project. The biblical narrative describes intricate details and the use of precious materials, such as cedar from Lebanon for the structure and pure gold for the adornments, reflecting the king's dedication and reverence for God. The site chosen for the temple, Mount Moriah, had deep symbolic meaning, as it was the same place where Abraham demonstrated his faith by being willing to sacrifice his son, Isaac. This act of faith and obedience, which occurred before the construction of the temple, highlighted the continuity of the special relationship between God and his people. Solomon's temple became the spiritual and cultural epicenter of Israel, a symbol of unity and worship. Solomon also dedicated himself to strengthening international alliances, cementing trade and diplomatic relations. A notable example of these foreign relations was the visit of the Queen of Sheba, who came to test Solomon's wisdom. These events are recorded in the first book of Kings, chapter 10, verses 1 to 13, and in the second book of Chronicles, chapter 9, verses 1 to 13. Upon arriving in Jerusalem, the Queen of Sheba tested Solomon's wisdom by asking him difficult questions. The Bible records that Solomon answered all of her questions satisfactorily, leaving no doubt unanswered. The Queen's journey to Jerusalem was marked by an impressive caravan, laden with a great quantity of spices, gold, and precious stones. The exchange of gifts during this visit emphasizes the diplomatic nature of the encounter. In addition to the visit of the Queen of Sheba, Solomon also established diplomatic relations with other kingdoms, making alliances with princesses from neighboring nations such as Egypt and Phoenicia. This practice, common at the time, was intended to strengthen alliances and promote peace between kingdoms. However, throughout his reign, Solomon was not immune to failure. Although he was celebrated for his wisdom and great accomplishments, his story also includes mistakes and deviations that eventually affected his reign and the history of Israel. One of Solomon's major deviations was his involvement with foreign women, something that was at odds with divine instructions. The Bible records that Solomon loved many foreign women in addition to Pharaoh's daughter, and took for himself princesses from neighboring nations, contrary to God's law, which prohibited marriages with women who worshipped other gods. These marriages, although political alliances, introduced foreign cultural and religious influences into Israel. The foreign wives brought with them their religious practices and gradually began to negatively influence Solomon. He began to tolerate the worship of idols and to participate in rituals that were contrary to the exclusive worship of the God of Israel. The culmination of this deviation was the building of temples to idols in honor of the deities of his wives, an act that directly contradicted the commandments given by God. This apostasy, which included the building of altars to deities such as Ashtoreth and Milcom, provoked the wrath of God. Solomon's final days, as recorded in chapters 11 and 12 of the book of 1 Kings, were marked by a mixture of glory and shadow, reflecting the complexities of his life and rule. As Solomon grew older, his past choices, especially regarding his marriages to foreign women and his acceptance of idol worship, began to negatively affect his reign. God's wrath was expressed, and he raised up adversaries against Solomon. Jeroboam, a trusted official, rebelled against the king and rose to become a prominent leader, eventually becoming the leader of the northern tribes. Solomon's death marked the end of an era. After a 40-year reign, he died, leaving a legacy that included the magnificent construction of the temple in Jerusalem and a period of unprecedented peace and prosperity. Although the Bible does not provide specific details about the cause of Solomon's death, the first book of Kings, chapter 11, verses 41-43, records the following. The rest of the acts of Solomon, all that he did, and the wisdom he displayed, are they not written in the book of the Acts of the Kings of Israel? The days that Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel were 40 years. Then he rested with his ancestors and was buried in the city of David his father. After Solomon's death, the kingdom of Israel entered a tumultuous and crucial period of transition. Solomon, widely recognized for his wisdom, splendor, and grandiose projects, came to the end of his reign, leaving a legacy of glory, but also of hardship. The construction of the temple and the expansive activities of the kingdom generated high taxes and required a significant labor force. Over time, these heavy impositions began to cause discontent among the tribes and the general population. The people, who had previously admired Solomon for his wisdom, now felt the weight of the obligations imposed on them in the name of his greatness. The political environment became tense, with growing dissatisfaction among the tribes. In addition, social issues began to influence this scenario, with the division between social classes becoming more evident. While an elite group benefited from Solomon's conquests, the rest of the population suffered the consequences of the government's policies. This climate of discontent and division prepared the ground for the reign of Rehoboam and the decisions that would change the course of Israel's history. From that point on, the kingdom of Israel would face serious challenges. Unlike his father, Rehoboam inherited a kingdom in crisis. Although Solomon was known for his wisdom and the grandeur of the temple he built, his reign, although prosperous, generated discontent among the people. The demands of supporting his monumental achievements became a heavy burden for many. There was great hope that Rehoboam, upon assuming the throne, would take steps to alleviate the heavy taxes and other demands imposed by his father's reign. The people wanted a leader who understood their difficulties, someone willing to listen and respond to their concerns. At the decisive moment of the royal succession, Rehoboam, now heir to the throne, found himself in a meeting with the representatives of the people of Israel. This meeting was not just a formality, but a crucial moment that would define the future of the kingdom. The representatives of the people expressed the hardships faced by the people due to the excessive demands of Solomon's reign. The heavy taxes, the burden of forced labor, and the increasing demands caused widespread discontent. When Rehoboam was faced with the decision of how to respond to the demands of the people, he received two distinct pieces of advice. On the one hand, the elders, wise and experienced, offered prudent guidance based on their deep knowledge of the dynamics of the kingdom. They advised Rehoboam to adopt a more understanding approach, softening his demands and showing empathy for the tribes of Israel. On the other hand, his younger advisors, perhaps influenced by the energy of youth and a more immediate vision, suggested an authoritarian approach. They encouraged Rehoboam to reinforce his demands, adopt a firm stance, and command respect, seeking to maintain control over the people. Faced with this conflicting advice, Rehoboam decided to follow the suggestion of his younger advisors. Rehoboam, influenced by the advice of his younger advisors, chose an inflexible stance, refusing to ease the heavy burdens imposed during Solomon's reign. His decision sparked a wave of discontent that quickly turned into widespread dissatisfaction. The northern tribes, led by Jeroboam, could not bear the continued oppression and the king's refusal to meet their needs. This tumultuous scenario culminated in Jeroboam's decision to lead the separation of the northern tribes, forming the Kingdom of Israel, known simply as Israel. After the division, Rehoboam, king of Judah, attempted to mobilize an army to regain control over the new northern kingdom. However, divine intervention was present. God sent a clear message, forbidding the southern tribes to pursue military action and instructing them not to fight against their own brethren. God also revealed that the division was under his control and that everything was happening according to his sovereign will, as recorded in the book of 1 Kings, chapter 12, verse 24. The book of 1 Kings also records that God sent the prophet Ahijah to deliver messages of judgment against Jeroboam and his house because of the apostasy and idolatry that had marked his reign. Ahijah prophesied before the emerging leader, predicting the rise of the northern kingdom and offering guidance for Jeroboam's future. The prophet instructed Jeroboam to lead according to divine principles with the promise of a lasting dynasty if he obeyed. However, disobedience would have serious consequences. Fearing that his subjects might return to Jerusalem for their religious pilgrimages, Jeroboam made the unfortunate decision to build altars with golden calves in Bethel and Dan as alternative places of worship. This not only diverted the people from the spiritual traditions centered in Jerusalem, but it also introduced idolatry, leading them away from true worship. This strategy not only symbolized political separation, but also established a distinct identity for the northern kingdom of Israel. Meanwhile, in the southern kingdom of Judah, Rehoboam faced the consequences of his choices. With the separation, Judah became a smaller kingdom centered in Jerusalem, but with the line of David's descendants on the throne. The temple and religious traditions continued under the authority of the southern kingdom, and the Davidic dynasty continued to rule, albeit on a reduced scale. The biblical narrative highlights that under Rehoboam's reign, Judah faced challenges and conflicts. The king sought to consolidate his power and strengthen Judah's position, but he also had to deal with external and internal threats. There were periods of political instability and clashes with neighboring nations. The Bible does not provide specific details about Rehoboam's death, but the second book of Chronicles mentions that he reigned in Jerusalem for 17 years. After his death, his son Abijah, also known as Abijam, succeeded him on the throne of Judah. As for Jeroboam, the Bible does not describe the exact circumstances of his death, but it does mention that he reigned for 22 years before he died. The Book of Kings reports that Jeroboam slept with his ancestors and that his son Nadab became king in his place. The arrangement of a divided kingdom with two independent states did not last long. The northern kingdom, led by a succession of kings who often strayed from God's ways, lasted only 2 centuries. Just as the prophet Ahijah had predicted, the collapse of the northern kingdom occurred in 722 BCE when it was conquered. Following attacks by the Assyrian armies, Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom, was besieged and eventually conquered. The people of Israel were taken into exile and scattered among the nations. The southern kingdom, known as Judah, faced a similar fate, but at a later date. As Babylon emerged as a conquering power, Jerusalem, the capital of Judah, fell to Babylonian forces in 586 BCE. The temple, the central symbol of Jewish worship, was destroyed, and a significant portion of the population was taken captive to Babylon. Thus, Rehoboam's ill-fated decision not to unify the tribes under his rule ultimately triggered the division and eventual collapse of his kingdom. The history of both Israel and Judah is replete with episodes of idolatry in which the people turned to false gods and abandoned the Lord. In response, God sent a series of prophets to warn the people and hold them accountable. Prophets such as Isaiah, Jeremiah, Hosea, and Amos highlighted the spiritual and temporal consequences of disobedience. Divine discipline was manifested through foreign invasions, exiles, and the destruction of cities. The history of the northern and southern kingdoms serves as a constant reminder of the importance of loyalty to God and the spiritual consequences of disobeying His commands. The Babylonian captivity represents one of the darkest periods in Israel's history, marked by the fall of Jerusalem, the exile of the people to Babylon, and, paradoxically, by the remarkable work of prophets such as Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. The captivity narrative begins with the invasion of King Nebuchadnezzar II and his Babylonian troops into Jerusalem. This event culminated in the destruction of the temple and the deportation of the Jewish population to Babylon, an exile that would last several decades. The city, once a symbol of the divine presence, was reduced to rubble, and God's chosen people were taken captive to a foreign land. In the midst of this crisis, prophets emerged who played crucial roles in guiding and comforting the exiled people. Jeremiah, known as the Prophet of Tears, foresaw the impending destruction of Jerusalem and urged the people to accept divine discipline. Daniel, a captive in the Babylonian court, was noted for his faithfulness to God in the midst of adversity, as well as his ability to interpret dreams and visions. Ezekiel, who was among the exiles, delivered visions and symbolic messages, emphasizing the importance of repentance and hope in a restored future. Before the Babylonian exile, Ezekiel was a priest in the temple in Jerusalem, but in 597 BC, after Nebuchadnezzar's invasion, he was deported to Babylon, along with King Jehoiachin and other leaders. In this context, Ezekiel went from priest to prophet, receiving powerful visions and direct messages from God. During this time, the people of Israel were facing the consequences of their disobedience to their covenant with God, known as the Mosaic Covenant or Sinai Covenant. This covenant was established when Moses led the people out of Egypt, as recorded in the book of Exodus, especially in chapters 19 through 24. The Mosaic Covenant was a mutual promise between God and Israel. God gave the Israelites the 10 Commandments and a series of laws to guide their moral, ethical, and ritual conduct, promising blessings in exchange for obedience. God promised to bless and protect Israel, making it a special nation among the peoples. However, this covenant also contained warnings about the consequences of disobedience. God warned that if the people strayed from His laws, they would face judgment and punishment, including exile and the loss of divine blessings. Throughout history, the Israelites frequently strayed from the covenant, and the situation became more serious after the reign of Solomon. When the United Kingdom of Israel was divided into two parts, the northern tribes, led by Jeroboam, rebelled against the southern kingdom of Judah, whose first king was Solomon's son, Rehoboam. This political and religious division resulted in a period of instability and idolatry. In both kingdoms, successive kings were often characterized by their relationship with God, with some seeking fidelity to the Lord, while others turned away into idolatry and disobedience to the 10 Commandments. The Babylonian exile, which culminated in the destruction of Jerusalem and the captivity of the people, was seen as a direct manifestation of the consequences of breaking this covenant. Disobedience to God's laws resulted in divine judgment, and the exile was a reflection of God's previous warnings. Amidst this scenario of desolation and despair, Ezekiel was called by God to deliver messages of warning, comfort, and hope to the captive people. He prophesied for approximately 22 years, sharing symbolic visions and powerful sermons. Ezekiel played a crucial role in communicating God's will, revealing promises of restoration and emphasizing the importance of repentance for reconciliation with God. In Ezekiel chapter 37 verses 1 to 10, there is a powerful narrative that describes a supernatural vision the prophet had. He relates how the hand of the Lord led him in spirit to a valley full of dry bones. This valley represented a scene of desolation and death, symbolizing the desperate condition of the people of Israel during the Babylonian exile. As Ezekiel walked through the valley, he noticed that the bones were numerous and completely dry, indicating that these people had been dead for a long time. Then God asked Ezekiel the crucial question, "Son of man, can these bones live?" Ezekiel responded with a profound declaration of faith, "Lord God, you know." This answer not only acknowledges God's sovereignty, but also expresses implicit confidence in his power over life and death. Ezekiel's faith is revealed in his willingness to accept the seeming impossibility of the situation and trust in God's ability to accomplish the extraordinary. His response reflects a faith that transcends visible circumstances, grounded in the certainty of God's omnipotence. Faith, in this context, is the catalyst that triggers divine intervention. The vision of the Valley of Dry Bones vividly illustrates how faith can transform seemingly hopeless situations. In the Christian life, experiences of revival are closely linked to robust faith, which trusts in God's ability to bring life to what seems dead. God then gave Ezekiel a specific instruction: to prophesy over the dry bones and proclaim the word of the Lord. The divine command was intended to bring life to that which seemed completely hopeless. Ezekiel's prophetic word was addressed to the dry bones, summoning them to hear the word of the Lord. The divine response came immediately when God, through the prophet, declared that he would bring life to these bones by causing spirit to enter them. In this context, the term spirit refers to the breath of life. The vitality that comes from God is clearly demonstrated by Ezekiel's willingness to follow divine instructions, even without fully understanding the purpose or the end results. This gesture reflects humility, trust, and submission to the divine will. The narrative goes on to describe how the bones unite, gain tendons, muscles, and skin, forming complete bodies. However, even with this physical restoration, the bodies were still lifeless. God then instructs Ezekiel to prophesy about the wind, which symbolizes the Spirit of God, to bring the breath of life. The result is impressive. The bodies receive the Spirit, rise up as a great army, and are refreshed, which carries a deep symbolic meaning. This restoration represents the spiritually dead and desolate condition of the people of Israel during the Babylonian exile. The valley filled with dry bones is not just a geographical setting, but a vivid image of the hopelessness, desolation, and alienation from God that characterize the nation. The dry bones, as symbolic elements, illustrate the life that has gone. These bones represent the people of Israel in their spiritually dead condition, marked by disobedience to the covenant made with God. The image of dry bones evokes a sense of abandonment, despair, and lifelessness, highlighting the urgent need for divine intervention. The exile, a direct consequence of this disobedience, left the nation in a state of desolation where spiritual vitality was absent. The valley, often associated with death and contempt, is chosen as the appropriate setting for this vision, emphasizing the gravity of Israel's spiritual situation. The emergence of sinews, muscles, and skin indicates a complete physical restoration, which represents not only spiritual revitalization, but also the rebuilding of the nation of Israel as a whole. God promises to gather his scattered people, rebuild what has been destroyed, and restore wholeness to the nation. This vision is deeply symbolic and has implications for both the historical context of the exile and God's promises of spiritual restoration. It represents God's ability to bring life to that which is dead, to restore hope even in the most challenging situations, and to revive the nation of Israel spiritually. The transcendent message is God's promise to transform desolation into renewal, bringing life to those who are spiritually dead. In the face of this challenging scenario, God made an extraordinary promise of restoration, recorded in verses 5 to 6. Thus says the sovereign Lord, "Come, O breath from the four winds, and breathe on these slain, that they may live. Prophesy to the breath, prophesy, Son of Man, and say to it, Thus says the sovereign Lord, Come, O breath from the four winds, and breathe on these slain, that they may live." A crucial part of this promise is the return of the people of Israel to their own land. God declares that he will bring them out of the grave, symbolizing the end of the Babylonian exile. This promise is aligned with the earlier promises made to Abraham and his descendants, which guaranteed a promised land. It is a testimony to God's faithfulness in fulfilling his promises despite the people's transgressions. Furthermore, God assures that after this restoration, the people will recognize that He is the Lord. This implies a renewed recognition of divine sovereignty, a deeper understanding of His authority, and a return to true worship. The transformative experience is not only physical and national, but also spiritual, bringing the people back to an intimate and reverent knowledge of God. The Babylonian captivity was also a period of spiritual purification for the people of Israel. Far from their land and the temple, the people had the opportunity to reflect and repent. In His mercy, God did not abandon His people even in exile. Through the prophets, He offered words of comfort, promises of restoration, and guidance for them to seek peace in the city where they were exiled. This time became a period of spiritual renewal, in which the people began to seek God more intensely, recognizing the need for repentance and the importance of maintaining the covenant with the Lord. This process of purification prepared the way for the return to the Promised Land and the rebuilding of the temple after the decree of Cyrus, the Persian king. The period of restoration marked the beginning of a new chapter, with the return of the people to the Promised Land, the rebuilding of the temple and the walls of Jerusalem, the teaching of the law, and a remarkable spiritual awakening. After decades of Babylonian captivity, the Persian king Cyrus issued a decree allowing the Jews to return to their homeland. Under the leadership of Zerubbabel, Ezra, and Nehemiah, the people began their journey back. This return represented not only a physical movement, but also the beginning of a spiritual restoration. One of the first projects after the return was the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. Despite challenges and opposition, the temple was rebuilt under Zerubbabel's leadership, marking a spiritual rebirth and the re-establishment of religious practices. In addition, Ezra, a priest and scribe, played a key role in teaching and enforcing the law of Moses. He led a movement to restore the understanding and practice of the law among the people. Ezra promoted the public reading of the law, encouraging repentance and spiritual renewal. The people, upon hearing the law, experienced deep conviction of sin and sought God in repentance. This resulted in spiritual renewal, with the people committing themselves to obey and honor God. Nehemiah, in turn, led the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem, providing protection and security for the city. Despite the adversities, Nehemiah and the people persevered, completing the task with a remarkable example of cooperation and determination. The story of Nehemiah is told in the book of Nehemiah, which follows on from the book of Ezra. Together, these books recount the return of the Jewish exiles from Babylon and the subsequent rebuilding of Jerusalem, including the temple and its walls. Nehemiah is first mentioned when he was serving as the personal cupbearer to the Persian king Artaxerxes I. Nehemiah's period as cupbearer dates back to the Persian rule of the 5th century BCE, when the Persian Empire controlled a vast expanse of territory, including the region of Judah and Jerusalem. The position of cupbearer was much more than simply serving wine to the king. It was a position of trust and closeness to the monarch. As cupbearer, Nehemiah was not only responsible for ensuring the quality and safety of the drinks served to the king, but he also had the opportunity to be in direct contact with him, becoming a trusted advisor. Nehemiah needed to be attentive to detail, discreet, and develop a keen sensitivity. Nehemiah's closeness to the king allowed him to notice subtle changes in the monarch's behavior, as well as giving him an intimate understanding of the challenges and complexities of government, something that would be fundamental in his future actions. His position as cupbearer also brought him into contact with diplomatic matters, since the royal court often served as a setting for negotiations and interactions with other peoples and leaders. This environment provided Nehemiah with a practical education in political matters and leadership strategies. During Persian rule, there was a certain cultural and religious autonomy in the provinces, including Judah. After the death of Nebuchadnezzar, many Jews returned from Babylonian exile in accordance with the edict of King Cyrus. This return was linked to the process of rebuilding Jerusalem, including the temple and the walls, which had been destroyed. On a quiet day at the Persian court, where Nehemiah was serving as cupbearer to King Artaxerxes, he received life-changing news. A group of visitors from Judah arrived at the court with alarming reports of the devastation and ruin that had befallen Jerusalem, the city of his ancestors. Nehemiah asked them about the Jews who had escaped captivity and the state of the city. They told him, "The survivors of the captivity are in the province, suffering great suffering and humiliation. The walls of Jerusalem have been broken down and its gates burned." Hearing these words, a whirlwind of emotions filled Nehemiah's heart. The city he loved, the symbol of his heritage and faith, was all but destroyed. The walls were in ruins, and the once majestic gates were now in ruins. The news had a profound impact on him, forcing him to confront the harsh reality of the situation. Faced with this bleak panorama, Nehemiah did not give in to despair. Instead, he sought refuge in prayer. He retreated to the quiet of his room, away from the prying eyes of the court, and prostrated himself before the God of his ancestors. His prayer was more than a lament. It was a cry for divine guidance, wisdom, and intervention in the face of Jerusalem's dire situation. Nehemiah acknowledged God's sovereignty over all things and humbly confessed the sins of the people that had contributed to the city's distress. Nehemiah's prayer can be found in Nehemiah chapter 1 verses 4 through 11, where he says, "O Lord, the God of heaven, the great and awesome God, who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and keep his commandments, may your ears be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer of your servant, which I pray before you today, day and night, for your servants, the people of Israel. I confess that we have sinned against you. I and my people have committed sins and crimes. We have acted with extreme wickedness and have rebelled, not obeying your commandments, your ordinances, and the decrees that you gave to your servant Moses." The place that God had chosen to dwell with his name, Jerusalem, was in ruins. Aware of the greatness of the divine power that had delivered the people of Israel, Nehemiah turned to God with humility and fervor, asking that his plans be successful. He asked for favor before the king, with the purpose of being used as an instrument in God's hands to restore the city. His communion with God gave him clarity of purpose and the courage needed to face the challenges that lay ahead. Rather than give in to despair at the situation, Nehemiah began to plan for the reconstruction of the walls and the restoration of Jerusalem to its dignity. The desire to take action and help restore the city became an urgent need for Nehemiah. An opportunity presented itself when, on an ordinary day at the Persian court, King Artaxerxes noticed the sadness on the face of his cupbearer. The king asked the reason for Nehemiah's melancholy, since he did not appear to be ill. Nehemiah, somewhat startled by the king's question, replied, "May the king live forever. How could I not be sad, since the city, the place of my father's tombs, lies in ruins and its gates have been burned?" Upon hearing the cupbearer's sadness, King Artaxerxes, touched by Nehemiah's sincerity and loyalty, asked him what he wanted. Nehemiah, still a little afraid, made a quick prayer to God and replied to the king, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant is accepted in your presence, please send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, so that I may rebuild it." Surprisingly, the king granted Nehemiah permission to travel to Jerusalem and lead the rebuilding effort. This concession was more than a formal authorization. It was an act of trust and recognition of Nehemiah's ability. The king recognized his cupbearer's integrity and dedication and saw in him the right person to take on the great challenge of restoring Jerusalem's walls. Nehemiah set out for his homeland, shouldering the responsibility of leading the rebuilding effort. Upon arriving in Jerusalem, he did not simply survey the scale of the challenge in broad daylight. He understood that it was necessary to thoroughly assess the city's walls and gates. To this end, he made the strategic decision to conduct the inspection at night, when the city was silent and prying eyes were closed by sleep. Riding in secret and accompanied by a few trusted people, Nehemiah walked the city walls. Nehemiah's nighttime inspection was not just a physical examination of the walls, but a symbolic act of commitment and courage. In the darkness of the night, he saw the gaps in the walls and the possibilities for renewal and restoration that could arise. It is worth remembering that soon after his arrival, Nehemiah encountered skepticism and hostility from some local leaders who questioned his intentions and ridiculed his audacity in wanting to rebuild what had been destroyed. However, Nehemiah's determination did not waver. Nehemiah was not shaken by the discouraging words. With firm conviction, he continued to inspire the inhabitants of Jerusalem, leading them to believe in the possibility of reconstruction. He was not alone in this mission. The work team included skilled masons, carpenters, and craftsmen, each contributing their skills to restore the various sections of the walls. Men, women, young and old, were called upon to play an important role in this effort. The diversity of the team strengthened the task, reflecting Nehemiah's commitment to involving the entire community in the reconstruction. In addition to verbal opposition, Nehemiah had to face physical threats and intrigue. Those who opposed the restoration plotted to sabotage the efforts, devising plans to destabilize and discourage the workers. Attacks and sabotages occurred throughout the rebuilding process, but Nehemiah's tenacity stood out. He took security measures, organized defensive strategies, and posted guards to protect the city both day and night, standing firm in his purpose and resisting fear and intimidation. Although resources were limited and the logistical challenges were immense, Nehemiah was well prepared. Before setting out, he asked the king for letters of authorization, which enabled him to overcome several difficulties. The Bible records this request as saying, "If it pleases the king, give me letters to the governors of the province west of the Euphrates, that they may give me permission to pass through until I come to Judah, and also a letter to the keeper of the king's forests, that he may provide me with timber to cover the gates of the palace and the walls of the city, and for the house where I will live." The king, guided by the good hand of God upon Nehemiah, granted the request and also sent army captains and horsemen to accompany him. Nehemiah's return to Jerusalem represented not only the physical reconstruction of the walls, but also the beginning of a profound spiritual and social transformation in the community. With a broad vision, Nehemiah called everyone to read and study the scriptures, recognizing that the spiritual foundation was as essential as the physical walls. His inspiring leadership led the people back to the fundamental principles of their faith, renewing their commitment to God. In addition, Nehemiah implemented social reforms, seeking to correct issues of injustice and inequality. He addressed a situation in which the most vulnerable were being exploited through predatory lending, with some people charging exorbitant interest rates and putting others into unpayable debt. Nehemiah's response was swift and firm. He confronted those responsible publicly, demanding that they return what they had unjustly taken. His stance made it clear that under his leadership, exploitation would not be tolerated. In addition to correcting these specific abuses, Nehemiah implemented broader social reforms to address the structural issues affecting the community. His approach represented a call for the restoration of social justice, reflecting his concern for the overall well-being of the people. The worship of God became the center of daily life in Jerusalem, and Nehemiah encouraged the observance of the Sabbath and religious festivals, reaffirming the importance of rest and celebration as expressions of faith. Nehemiah also focused on strengthening the spiritual leadership in Jerusalem, appointing priests and Levites to prominent roles, ensuring that spiritual guidance was firmly established. The community's response to the reforms was remarkable. The people not only accepted the changes, but wholeheartedly committed themselves to the principles that were established. The community demonstrated a renewed commitment to God by actively participating in rituals and ceremonies, seeking to live according to the precepts of righteousness and justice. From the beginning, Nehemiah did not view his mission as a mere human project, but as a task guided by the divine hand. His unshakable faith was not just an aspect of his life, but the foundation on which he built his vision and actions. He recognized God's sovereignty over the challenges he faced, and this trust influenced each of his decisions and his leadership. Divine intervention became visible at critical moments, such as when Nehemiah, upon asking King Artaxerxes for permission to return to Jerusalem, had his request granted. This gesture was not just a political decision, but a response to Nehemiah's faith and prayers. During the rebuilding of the walls, difficulties and opposition were not overcome solely by human effort, but also by the supernatural intervention of God. The community, inspired by Nehemiah's leadership, faced challenges that seemed insurmountable, but divine protection was clear, as external threats did not impede the progress of the work. The success in rebuilding the walls cannot be attributed solely to human effort, but was undoubtedly shaped by divine intervention that was present every step of the way. The work of Ezra and Nehemiah, together with the active participation of the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, was fundamental to the spiritual reformation of the community. The renewal of dedication to God's service and the return to the covenant with Him were essential to re-establishing the relationship between God and His people. The Old Testament ends with the post-restoration prophets, including Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, whose messages called the people of Israel to reflect on their spiritual journey. After the closing of the Old Testament canon, the following period was marked by 400 years of apparent prophetic silence. During this time, no new books were recorded in the scriptures, and the voice of the prophets ceased to be heard. However, this silence did not indicate divine inactivity, but represented a period of preparation for the fulfillment of the messianic promises. The growing expectation for a Messiah, announced throughout the Old Testament, generated great expectation among the people of Israel. With the birth of Jesus Christ in Bethlehem, the New Testament began, marking the end of this silence. Christ, the promised Messiah, would bring the full fulfillment of divine promises, bringing redemption and salvation to humanity.